Hello and welcome back to another quick gen video, finally. Today's subject is a little heavier than usual because today we're talking about the heavies. So, heavies, or the heavy infantry, are the soldiers whose job it is to hold the line. They wear heavier armor and shields and tend to be, well, heavier than the rest of the soldiers. And that is probably the first thing that comes to mind about heavies. Heavies are big and dumb. In the same way that it's a commonly held belief among the soldiers that all sappers are crazy, most of their fellow soldiers hold that all heavies are dumb. Fiddler calls them slope brows, and Gessler wonders if they're even human. Hellion claims all heavies are idiots, but Hellion says that about everybody, so take that for what it's worth. They're often compared to beasts of burden, big as oxen and stubborn as mules. There's a running joke in Memories of Ice that a Bedaran bull is in love with the Tauren. And in the Glass Desert, when the oxen start to die off, it's the heavies that are expected to step in and pull the carts. Like animals, big and dumb. And like most stereotypes, there's some truth to it. There's Vastly Blank, who, as his name suggests, is by far the most cognitively challenged of the heavies. And he has one of the best, what I'm going to call heavy interactions with Draw First, after Smiles says she doesn't believe nefarious bread exists. Vastly reacts like a child who was just told by another kid that Santa Claus isn't real. He says, "That's because you're stupid, and I don't like you. Draw First, that's right, isn't it? I don't like her, do I? Do I? Do you know her, Vastly? No, Draw First, I don't. Not even that. Well then, it's gotta be that you don't like her. I knew it." The heavies are like the anti-T. Holland bug, and their funniest interactions come from a total lack of wit. So yeah, maybe there's some truth to the idea of heavies as stupid. And maybe that's not such a bad thing. After calling out from Egatan, Flashwit tells Mayfly that she wishes she was smart, and Mayfly says, "I ain't smart, and you know how I know? Because down there under the city, us heavies, we didn't get scared. Not one of us. That's how I know." In Egatan, the heavies took a terrifying situation and they reduced it to the simplest terms possible. Fire hurts, and so they needed to get away from it. Being stuck underground was a death sentence, and so the heavies kept moving. Yes, even animals have a survival instinct, but they also know terror. This is not the behavior of dumb animals. In fact, putting their heads down and getting the job done was the most rational response to the situation, and it's what the heavies do best. During that same conversation with Flashwit, Mayfly tells her that if soldiers thought too much about what they were doing, they wouldn't want to fight anymore. But you and me, Flashwit, we're heavy infantry, right? We plant our feet and we make the stand, and it don't matter what for. For Mayfly, being smart just means worrying and wondering about why they're fighting. The heavies know that the why doesn't really matter. It's the fight itself that's important. And man, do the heavies love fighting. So maybe the heavies aren't known for their wits, but there's a reason Smiles is always heading over to see what the heavies are up to. The heavies know how to have a good time. Whenever there's downtime, the heavies are doing something interesting. Playing games, wrestling, fighting, placing bets, and gossiping. There's a great scene in Dusted Dreams where Sholey wakes up from a nap in front of the fire and asks, "What's burning?" And upon being told that he's what's burning, Sholey, without taking his feet out of the fire, says, "Am I done yet?" Turns out the Heavies and the Marines have all placed bets on how long it'll take Sholey to notice and remove his feet from the fire. So he then proceeds to negotiate when he'll move his feet so that he can have a piece of the winnings. He's a Heavy, and Heavies always want in on the action. I think my favorite example of this is probably the scene in the desert outside of Yucatan when Bottle comes across a bunch of Heavies dismantling a wagon. He mentions that the axle doesn't look broken to him and is told that their squad had been eating this wagon's dust all the way across the desert. And so the Heavies were taking their revenge. If you've seen Office Space, this always reminds me of the scene where they take the baseball bats to the printer. The wagon is kicking up dust, and so the wagon will pay. But when they're not fighting or gambling or dismantling wagons, the Heavies are gossiping. They always have the best gossip and is often surprisingly accurate. Feridan asks Shorthand why the Heavies gossip, and he tells her it's entertainment. We chew them up till there's nothing left, and then we invent new ones. Heavies hate being bored. And among the rumors circulating the Bone Hunters, there is none greater than the legend of nefarious bread. And the Heavies are both the source and the heart and soul of most of these rumors. In battles, Nefarious kills more of the enemy than any other soldier. He single-handedly carries a dead horse to feed his squad. Nefarious Bread, even though he's never seen, is the ultimate soldier, and his acts of heroism are undermined only by the fact that he began his life as a piece of moldy bread. It's a joke that quickly and perhaps literally took on a life of its own. So when Fiddler and Hedge are saved by an unfamiliar soldier who claims his name is Nefarious Bread in the final battle, we're left wondering what really happened. And honestly, I don't want an explanation for this mystery. But I have always loved the idea that Nefarious Bread was made up of the Heavies' stubborn belief in him and the extremities of those Heavies who had lost body parts. There's this conversation between Keneb and Relico, in which Relico explains that the Heavies are all counting up their missing fingers to see if they could make a whole hand out of the severed digits. But they're missing a thumb. And so when Relico says he thinks maybe Nefarious Bread doesn't have any thumbs, Keneb ventures that maybe he's only missing one thumb, since he wouldn't be able to hold a weapon otherwise. And Relico replies, might be, in which case, as soon as we find a thumb, why, we'll let him know. But what I love about that is that the idea of Nefarious missing a thumb to him doesn't mean that they found another severed digit that they can add to their hand, but rather that it's the lack of someone missing a thumb that has resulted in Nefarious Bread also not having a thumb. But outside of Nefarious Bread, we rarely actually hear the Heavies gossiping amongst themselves, I don't think. Because a lot of the humor here comes from the reactions of other soldiers when they realize that these slope brows know more about what's going on than they do. In House of Chains, Tug is talking to Fiddler and Gessler and somebody named Borduke, and he tells them that he heard a rumor that Fiddler was once, One Arm's host and had been outlawed. And Gessler and Stormy were old guard and were responsible for rescuing the wounded from the chain of dogs, and that Borduke once threw a noble-born officer off a cliff, only they couldn't prove it. But, he could be wrong. And All three of them just stare at him open-mouthed. Then later, when Bottle goes to tell all the squads that Faradan's sort has called a meeting, it's the Heavies, and only the Heavies, that somehow already know about the meeting. And forget the deck of dragons. You want to know what's going to happen next? Just pay attention to the Heavies. In House of Chains, Moke keeps asking what they seem like really dumb questions, but which actually reveal an astounding amount of knowledge about Tavor's plans, including the conjecture that Tavor is going to do something unexpected, and as a result, the Bone Hunters won't get a fight with the Whirlwind Army at all. And then after Egatan, Mayfly asks Flashwit what she thinks they'll do next. And Flashwit says, save the world, maybe. 4 books later, it's exactly what they do. Shortnose thinks to himself in the Glass Desert, maybe the Heavies had been harnessed like oxen. That didn't mean they weren't paying attention to whatever was going on around them. Most of it wasn't worth chewing on, but sometimes some unguarded comment hung around. And then, when something else arrived, came back, and things started making sense. They weren't oxen. They were Heavies. Just like with Nefarious Bread and his body parts, the Heavies are good at putting the pieces together. So, how does this ability to figure out what's going on around them square with the idea that Heavies are stupid? The other soldiers like to compare them to pack animals, but then Krupp's mule is a pack animal too. This is Malazan, and like Fiddler says, after he realizes Shortnose is hiding a brain behind that messed up nose, sometimes things ain't what they seem. One of my absolute favorite scenes is when a group of Heavies get lost hunting at night and they can't find their way back to the Bone Hunters' camp. They're arguing about whether they were following a rabbit or a wolf. And Draw First, trying to convince others that it was a rabbit that attacked them, points out that they're on a different continent and says, beasts are different here. We keep hearing howling, but that could be rabbits. How do we know? But as they stand around discussing how to catch wolves by fishing for it with a horse on a hook, Karab turns around and tells all of them to cut the act, because he's a Heavy too. He says, don't even think about winking at me. I keep my peace, but I pay attention. I'm a Heavy too, so just stop it. Yeah, in part, he's annoyed because they're messing around instead of helping him find their way back. But mostly, Karab is upset because they're acting dumb, and he knows it's an act, and he thinks it's a sign that they don't see him as one of them. And that is something Karab is particularly sensitive to. Salt Lake tells him they were just having fun, and he could always join in. But, of course, Karab doesn't believe in funny things. It's like Shortnose said, Heavies hate being bored. It turns out the Heavies find their often ridiculous conversations to be just as entertaining as we do. That said, I don't think their own entertainment is the only reason the Heavies play up their reputation. One of the defining characteristics of the Heavies is that they see what needs to be done and they do it. The other soldiers may question or overthink things, but the Heavies are the shield that stands between them and the enemy. And those soldiers don't want their shield to question whether it stops the sword swinging for their heads. They just want it to hold, without thinking. This is what the army needs from its Heavies, and so that's what they do. It's a recurring theme in Malazan, this idea that there's something admirable and even heroic in the unwitnessed acts of those who are simply doing what needs to be done. And nobody embodies that theme better than the Heavies. And this gets to the heart of why I love the Heavies. There's an acceptance of the way things are, And that acceptance is extended to the soldiers they're fighting alongside. Like I mentioned earlier, Smiles, who doesn't like anyone, takes every chance she gets to hang out with the Heavies. And at first, it seems like maybe this is because she knows she can take advantage of them. But as we find out later, she's another one who doesn't fall for the act. Smiles built an armor of her anger, and her squad is constantly poking at that armor, finding the weak spots. The Heavies, they don't poke, they don't tease. Hanging out with the Heavies is the only time we see Smiles just relax and loosen her armor a bit. Because when she's with the Heavies, she doesn't need it. Beak, who is another soldier who would not be considered to have typical intelligence, struggles to feel accepted by his fellow soldiers. But Vastly Blank, who makes Beak look like a genius, is accepted and supported without question by the other Heavies. When Clasp comes to Salt Lick in Crippled God, asking for permission to join this elite group that she's certain exists within the Marines and Heavies that are close to Fiddler, Salt Lick doesn't deny the existence of these insiders. Because all that would have done was convince Clasp that the elites existed and she and her squad weren't good enough to be accepted. So instead, he just tells her that she's in. Her and all her soldiers are in. That simple. Mayfly says the why doesn't matter. The Heavies don't see the world as black and white or without nuance. Instead, they question whether that nuance is important. They recognize that there are a million different ways to interpret the words and actions of others, and for them, the best way forward is simply to keep chewing on it until it's been reduced to the bones, to the heart of the matter. Simple is not the same thing as stupid. The Malazan soldier is expected to think, but the Heavies, they're expected to do. If Marines are the heart of the army, the Heavies are its backbone. They stand strong and they do what needs to be done. Quick side note, I think it's really interesting that nearly half the Heavies we get to know are female, which makes it the most diverse division in terms of gender in the Army. That might feel counterintuitive, but while most of the female Heavies we meet do tend to be large, the truth is being a Heavy isn't actually about size. It's all about the attitude. Heavies are tough. They're strong-willed and stubborn, and a high pain tolerance helps too. And those are not gender-specific traits. For most of the series, the Heavies are looked down upon. They're laughed at and dismissed by their fellow soldiers. Smiles, Stormy, and Gessler, they have some appreciation for them, but for the most part, they're seen as good for fighting and not much else. And then the Bone Hunters meet the K'chain Naruk, and they watch in horror as their leaders and sorcerers fall in the face of this unstoppable force. There's no clever trick by the sappers that's going to get them out of this. No brave last stand by the Kundra will save them. No. The only reason the Bone Hunters survived long enough to withstand the attack is because the Heavies held. Even as they died, they refused to back up a single step. Through sheer stubbornness and strength of will, they did the job that had to be done. The Heavies held. And suddenly, these soldiers who'd been seen as oxen, useful but unintelligent, were afforded a level of respect rarely seen between soldiers within the Bone Hunters. The battle against the K'chain nearly destroyed them, but it didn't. And those that walked away, they knew that they did so not because of sorcery or outside intervention or even luck. No, they were still standing because of their fellow soldiers. For the first time in a major battle, the bone hunters saved themselves. And the crippled god, Vidal, watches as Shortnose pulls the wagon, and she thinks to herself, they call these soldiers Heavies, the ones who don't stop, who don't fall down, who don't die, the ones who make the others keep going until they fall over dead. These soldiers, Heavies. That's it. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time.